dream and idealize your community. When things such as mining happen and you see there are things that are wrong, you realize you need to talk to them as people. And to people, you are also critical. You also tell them the hard stuff. But look, this does not mean you are on the side of Parques Nacionales defending some abstract ideas about conservation. What you're doing is being tuned to the territories. And you have to make the territory visible, put it on the table, and talk frankly about it, make people see things. Both paisanos and Parques Nacionales need to see things, to see the territories, and territories are going through changes. This does not mean you are responding to one side or the other. This is not about sides. This means you are being attentive to the pulses of the territory. Pulses of the territory shed light on what it was that local officers were bringing to our conversation with Marisol de la Cadena. Their work moves within the difficult thin line defined by their being accountable to both Parques Nacionales and indigenous people. The earth beings that these officers summon and their pulsations are shaped both by their not wanting to hand over indigenous territories to white people and by their concern for what they perceive as the destruction of nature for which they feel responsible, educated as they are in Parques Nacionales. Being attentive to these particular pulses of the territory, opening space for them in the zones of the encounter, and translating them into conservation politics was precisely what we felt these officers did. So these are Hernan and Edgar, my friends who visited me the last day. And this research, it took a long time because it was part of our PhD, so it was funded by many different institutions. And the latest part, to be able to sit down and write about it, was thanks to the Carson Center where Kat and I met. Yeah. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
Is there still gold mining? I mean, what's the status of that? Or, what other invasive projects may be happening?
Yeah, in the Amazonian parks, I would say my latest research is not in the Amazon, so I'm not totally updated. But I think the main threats to Amazonian parks is still partly gold mining. Yeah, I think that's the biggest. Yeah, and also illegal logging, of course, big. Land use changes in the last years after the signature of the peace agreements. This territory, many of these territories, not Amacayacu, but farther north in the Colombian Amazon, they were controlled by guerrillas, or they were solid social agreements to protect the land somehow. But after the peace agreements and the guerrilla left, now there is the wood logging has increased dramatically in the last few years, unfortunately.
You mentioned that some groups asked to have national parks in the
Yes.
resort. Why? Why did they do that?
Because that's a really interesting story, very complex. But mainly it's because in Colombia the only territorial ordering figure that really forbids mining is national parks, not even resguardos. Indigenous resguardos are more vulnerable, so if the mining company manages to convince part of the community to, with all the strategies that they have to develop mining in their territories, they can do it. But if a park is declared, it's impossible. It's the only figure. So these indigenous communities asked for this declaration. And it was really interesting because national parks has criteria for prioritizing the places where they declare national parks, because of course they don't have funding to do all the parks everywhere. And in principle, the Amazonian rainforest was already overrepresented in the system of national parks. So it was not so obvious that with biological scientific criteria this would be a priority. So it was really a political, like a very important moment where despite, where local priorities won over scientific or, yeah.
I have a question about the park officers. It's incredible the kinds of negotiations they're able to do. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe when they're not successful or when they enter into conflict, especially if they're from the communities themselves and also representing the state? And then also, if you have time, you could maybe talk about any kinds of conflicts with individual landowners or land users inside of the parks that are not part of the indigenous community.
Yeah. Of course. What I was interested in looking at here it was in this mediation role, but it's not always the case. And it's also, these two national parks have, despite their differences, they also have some particularities because there is not such a long history of conflict between indigenous people and white people in general, and the state more specifically. So, for instance, in parks that coincide with indigenous territories in the southern part of the Andes, for instance, the conflicts are really strong. And it's like in one park a few years ago, indigenous people didn't allow park officers to go into the area. They just block all the roads, and so this is really not generalizable at all. And of course, it's not easy if you have to forbid fishing and it's your cousin the one who's fishing, or if you have to control. So up to some point, they are capable of negotiating and convincing, so to say, national parks that using is also a way of doing conservation. But it's not always easy, and very often they are also in the middle of violent situations because of that. And the second question I forgot.
If there's any individual private land users.
Of course. Yeah, the thing is, in Colombia there are now, I think, 59 national parks, and there is such a huge diversity that it's really difficult to generalize, because in many places, of course, there are problems with private landowners, and they are, in some cases, like close family relatives of park officers, and it's really hard. Yeah, I don't know how to give an overview of that, because it's really complicated.
Yeah, but it's like kind of unrelated as well, so maybe elsewhere.
Mine is also going in a different direction. I wondered if you wanted to comment a little bit about Humboldt Institute now as an institution, because we all heard about Humboldt Institute, as a place of research and as a place of action, like environmental action. How could you comment the role of the institute in the context of what you are talking about in the talk?
Well, this research was made before I worked in the Humboldt Institute. I worked in national parks, and then I did my PhD. It was like a ethnography of the state, you could say. And then after that, I started working for the Humboldt Institute. But you could say it's similar in as far as the institute is in the interface between science and policy. So we have to do decision-oriented research. So in principle, our research is about, the institute was created in the early 90s along with the national environmental system, with the Ministry of the Environment and other research institutes in the country. So the Humboldt Institute is in charge of research on biodiversity in the continental part of Colombia, but there is a similar research institute for the Caribbean, there is another for the Amazon region, another for the Pacific region, and another specialized in more climate research and environmental research. Yeah, climate research and water. So the Humboldt Institute is mainly, its main task, according to the Convention on Biological Diversity is to do the inventory or to keep up the inventory of biodiversity in the country updated. So originally it was like a biologist's institute, but of course it has evolved and now it has 4 research programs. 2 of them are more like basic science, basic biological sciences. Another one is on social, it's called social sciences related to biodiversity and local forms of knowledge or something like that. And that's not where the group where I work, but that's where most of my friends are. And there is another program, research program, where I work, which is, I don't know how to translate that, but it's the one that's supposed to do the bridge between the institute's research and the policymakers and the Ministry of the, mainly the Ministry of the Environment is our main working partner, so to say, and most of the funding for the institute comes from the Ministry of the Environment. So in that group, I am in charge of doing research. My research line is called environmental conflict. So, and it's especially around what the country has called strategic ecosystems, which are páramos. Mainly, I work mainly on páramos, which are upper mountain ecosystems, where most of the water for Colombians comes from. So we do, at the same time we carry out research, but it needs to be oriented to answer questions, particular questions asked by decision makers, which can be anything, because everybody's a decision maker, but the Institute works mainly for the Ministry of the Environment and for regional environmental authorities. But we have also worked with zonas de reserva campesina, which are campesino social organizations. And yeah, it's like very diverse work, really. Yeah. And there is also constant negotiation of times, right? Like I explained here between national parks, and because decision-making times are very quick and they cannot wait until you have an answer, like what you from science would say, like a more rigorous answer would need more time, but they need to do things tomorrow. So that's a constant negotiation that takes place there as well.
So is the institute a government organization or is it independent?
It's mixed, which is weird because there are not many organizations like this. So the institute receives money from the Ministry of the Environment, but it can also do private, receive money from international cooperation agencies, and it can also receive money from private companies or stuff like that. So it's from that point of view, it's also a very complicated situation, especially from the perspective of environmental conflicts, which I'm now studying. Of course, the institute is often part of the conflict because it represents the state in some contexts, but at the same time it makes research that sometimes criticizes what the state is doing.
Yeah, but that's what I was going to say. The independence of the studies from the institute might be compromised if it is a governmental institution, and usually there's always the government might be involved in the big part of the discussion. Right?
Of course, that's a very complex thing that happens to all research institutes in the world. It's not exclusive of the Humboldt Institute, because the money, if it's a public institution, the money comes from the government. And if it's not public, the money comes from the industries or, so it's really difficult to carry out national research of this size and with all these implications funded by something that's not either a state or a private institution. So I think one of the challenges of the Institute is to be very transparent about how they are asking questions and for whom they are answering the questions, but it's still a complicated thing and it's not solved at all.
When was the Institute founded and named?
The Institute was founded in 1994, before, I would say, like in the early 90s. I don't remember the year exactly. And the name, it's often confused with the German Humboldt Institute or Humboldt Universität or such things, but it has nothing to do with any of them. It was named after Humboldt because Humboldt was in Colombia, so they decided it was a good name. Also to keep the idea of studying nature in an integral way, as Humboldt thought it should be studied, and so, yeah.
So it was a Colombian decision to choose that name?
Yes. I think it was also, I don't know if it was deliberately so, but it has, of course, political implications in a way, because being named Humboldt in a country that is still colonial in a way is different than if it had like an indigenous name or something like that, it would have different implications.
Well, the early 90s was a time where political things changed a bit elsewhere.
Yeah, that's right.
I was just curious if you could talk about, I don't know if you have been observing that, but maybe that happened more in the Macuira National Park. But like, how are these territories changing with the arrival or like the coming in of refugees from Venezuela?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer, but I think that's important because most of these Wayu people, they don't feel like Colombians or Venezuela. They are from the whole region, so they don't acknowledge the borders. So that would be really interesting I will ask. I have no idea.
Can you say a little more about potential language barriers? Because you alluded to some differences in conceptual frameworks, no? But what about language in communities that not everybody speaks Spanish?
In Amacayacu, all the communities speak Spanish. Actually, many of them don't speak their indigenous language anymore. So that's not an issue there. And in Macuira, I did not do my research there, but I will try to tell what I heard from Julia. Actually, in the chapter, there is one story that I didn't include today because it would have made the presentation too long, which was really interesting. And it is in one meeting where there were people from the Wayu authorities, Wayu chiefs, and people from Bogota and from Santa Marta who came there for a meeting. It was a very long meeting, like all day long, and the indigenous chiefs, the idea of the meeting was to ask for permission to carry out scientific research in some part of the park. So the indigenous people, the indigenous chiefs had the right to speak first, and they spoke for hours and hours and hours in Wayunaiki that none of the people who were invited understood. And yeah, they spoke, and in the end, like after, I don't know, many hours in the middle of the heat of the desert, the translator, who is a local officer, turned to the people who came from Bogota and told them, the chief says that you're welcome to come here, but they still have to consider some of the issues. And that was it. So I think that's a nice example of how the dance takes place in the rhythms set by the local people. So I'm sure there are many more stories of interesting stories about this language, this use of the language barriers, but I don't know any other.
Thank you for your talk. I'm intrigued about how bureaucracy works, and I would like to
Everybody is.
yeah, I would like to hear more about paperwork, on how they were mediating between the paperwork culture that is so important in Bogota in contrast to their own practices. So
Yeah.
you could tell us more about it.
Yes. Yes, that's also something that really intrigued me and made me laugh all the time because it was so absurd, you know, in Bogota, all these, I was working in the Bogota offices and there was all these like big lists of things that needed to be done as if the parks were in cities, right? So they needed to make photocopies of things or send CDs, or it's like you have no idea what the parks that you're working with, you know? So, what the people, that's also another story that it's in the chapter, but I didn't bring it here. In Amacayacu, for instance, one of the administrator of the park, the chief of the park, showed me like a list of homework that he had to send to Bogota, like all kinds of formats to fill in and all kinds of, you know, all this paperwork. And he showed it to me and he said, so this is why we try to spend we try to spend the most possible time doing what needs to be done and the least possible time doing what they ask us to do. So somehow they manage to prioritize and to do the very indispensable homework, and the others just, you know, they're very good in prioritizing and in not doing everything they are asked to do and not to. I also did some interviews trying to find out which criteria they had to hire people in the parks, and one of the park of high officers of another national park in the Amazon told me, I don't want the good student is not a good officer for me because he will try to do all the homework, and if he spends all his time or her time doing the homework, he or she won't do what needs to be done, which is to be with the people in the field, you know. So it's like, yeah, that was. Another one told me what actually the way management takes place in our parks is the following. It's called PAT. I don't know. He gave me like something that sounded very serious and important. And in Spanish, it's planeación aleatoria tropical participativa, which is like participatory, tropical, aleatoria, random planning. So this is also a sign of, you know, they do things because they have to do them so that they get the funding from the central office and they get what they need. But actually each park is, or used to be when I worked there, I don't know if anymore, quite independent nations, so to say. Yeah.
Do we know any of their stories? Because, you know, the local time, which is their unique history, and their literature is not so maybe developed, and mainly through the oral transmission, the generation to the next generation. And you get any of their typical stories to describe those kind of metaphysics things?
I did not deepen into that. I was looking more at the more boring and more superficial institutional stories. But of course there are many, about Wayu, there has been a lot of research on their the story of the history of the territories. It's the Wayu have been in those territories much longer than the Ticuna, because as I explained earlier, the people in the Amazon have been displaced many times. So it's more difficult in that particular part of the Amazon where Amacayacu is. Most of the indigenous people who are there are not in their like ancestral territories, so they have history, but the memory has been lost, and new also important stories have emerged. But in the Wayu territories, it's much more like ancient. But unfortunately, I don't know.
When you mentioned that the indigenous territories were created after the establishment of the park, is it because those communities were displaced there, were moved to those areas?
No, it was because the Colombians, in Colombia there is a new constitution since 1991, there is someone here who could explain this history much better than I could. But many indigenous people have always been in their territories, but they have gone through the bureaucracy for their recognition, their official recognition after the Constitution of 1991. So,
Paula, have any of the leaders that you dealt with or that you worked with, indigenous leaders, have been involved in the recent violent conflicts or have been victimized by the violence recently?
in Amacayacu, no. Amacayacu is it's close to Leticia. It's very touristic. It's, I don't know, it's not close to the agricultural frontier. So somehow it's like isolated from the main violent conflict in the country. Yeah, other people that I knew in other Amazonian regions, in the Caquetá River, where I did my undergraduate research in ecology, they have had to leave their lands because of this land grabbing process. So they are threatened, and I've met them in Bogota. Yeah. But in Amacayacu, no. And La Guajira, I don't know.
One last question. It's your last question. Your question is last.
Oh. I was interested in the gender distinctions, and it might complicate the bureaucratic local people interactions. Have you found any gender confusions between the two groups, the external people and the local people, like expectations from the park folks about who they should speak with, what topics?
Yes. Actually, one of the things that I thought was so interesting in Namacayacu was that when I mentioned this negotiation of politics and how it takes place in the territories, for instance, for defining these conservation objects that then became integral conservation priorities, they are supposed to carry out workshops with people, and it doesn't give, like the national guidelines don't give any indication of how to do that more precisely. But of course, local officers were very aware that depending on the kind of knowledge that they needed or that they wanted to be represented in the management plans, they needed to talk to women or to men or to young people or to older people. So it was really interesting to see how they designed the participatory processes according to this knowledge of how, for instance, gender things work. So they made jokes about how if you ask men, you will only find out about 4 species in the orchards, but you need to talk to women because women are the ones who know the, 200 species that are in the orchards. So, but then also if you are interested in knowing about hunting species that they hunt for food, it's the men that you need to talk to, and not any man. And so they were very aware of that. It would be interesting to know more details about the Wayu part, because Wayu communities have they inherit through maternal, through the women in the families are the ones that inherit from their mother. So I'm sure they were very, they needed to be very aware of who the powerful woman in the family is in order to carry out any negotiation. But unfortunately, that's not where I studied, so I don't know the details there.
Well, thank you so much for this exciting talk and discussion.
Thank you. Yo soy Diana. ¿Qué tal?
Study Latin America?
Like, it is hard to contact
Oh, okay. But you do for your study? Huh? Oh, cool.
Next week is Georgia. There's a lot going on there. Are you excited?
Yeah. I know. And that's wonderful for me.
Oh, I know, yeah.